Welcome to Lecture 24, Structural Functions. Now, structural functions are rather interesting because what we're doing is determining the purpose of the unfolding of an entire piece of music. And this reflects the organizational principles of the entire piece. And they really are more or less categorized into four functions: expository, which is the initial material being laid out; transitional, which could lead up to a second exposition material, or any one of the other areas; developmental, which is to take something and start varying it, playing around with it, if you will; and then the terminative, which is the function of the section is to end the piece. Now, sometimes we have a terminal section that ends a large section of a piece, and then it's followed by a new exposition. So we're going to see how these are used. We're going to do some exercises with it, and I think you'll get a lot from this. The structural functions are realized in motives, phrases, periods, which is a group of phrases, phrase groups, which are just a chain of phrases, and then sometimes other structural units. But each unit can be used to express a particular structural function. So let's examine that. Let's start with the expository function. This is the most important one because it lays out all the material. So let's define it. The expository function is musical material that's exposed for the first time. So in Beethoven's Fifth Symphony, that's the first thing that one hears. Now, this is analogous to an opening sentence, a declarative or thesis statement in literature. And typically, it's a periodic section with clear moments of delineation. Now, what we mean by that is, at the end of that expository material, we'll usually find a cadence, or we'll find a moment of modulation to something that's similar to what we just heard. Or we'll come to an open ending, like maybe a half cadence or a deceptive cadence. But the expository function lays out the opening material. Now, what makes for a really strong piece of music is to hear the elements of that exposition varied, repeated, and otherwise developed. So let's look at a Haydn example. And this is from the Sonata in E minor. And what we're going to look for is where the expository material really falls. So this starts at measure 19 of the particular movement, and it goes to measure 40. So listen to this expository material. Cadence. That's a half cadence. Now you can hear right there, by the time we get to right around measure 27, we begin to hear some developmental variation of that opening material. So the expository section would be, from the beginning of this, 19 all the way to 26. Then 27 through 40 is kind of a developmental variation of the opening motive. And measure 27 through 40 ends with an authentic cadence and provides a sense of resolution, and closes with the same gesture, basically, as measure 25, but it closes on the tonic. Let's continue. This is a little digression. Now opening material. Down an octave. Now back up. Which ends on the tonic. So this whole section is expository. Now it has slight little developmental moments in it. And you could call that second section, this little digression with the sequence, is slightly developmental. But overall, this entire section from measure 19 all the way to 40, we would term the expository material. Now what follows it will be some developmental material. So that's the idea. In any piece you're looking at, find out what the expository material is. It might be just a motive, a phrase, or a whole section. The next most interesting idea is the transitional function. And kind of like with this puzzle, the red piece connects the two sides. Well, that's exactly what a transition does. It's a connecting section. So the connecting function between sections is what makes this transitional function what it is. So it supports the perception of movement. Often it's sequential, so it might be, it could be something as simple as that, which all of a sudden takes a sequence into a new section. It's often very different material from what we've heard in the exposition. So in other words, on the bordering sections, it's different from what precedes it and what follows it. It's often unpredictable, and great variation with structural phenomena like articulations, rhythm, pitch changes, contour changes are often very typical in transitions. It's often modulatory in nature and disruptive of the original key centers that set up new ones. So let's look at an example from Beethoven. We're going to ask these questions. Now, when you do your assignment, I want you to use these questions. This PowerPoint will be made available to you. So you'll ask yourself, when you're looking for transitional functions, where does the transition begin? Where does it end? What purpose does it serve? Etc. Just like we looked at the exposition, you want to give me measure numbers, give me some description of that. So let's listen to what Beethoven wrote. Cadence. Oh, new material. New exposition material. And we're in a new key. So what purpose does it serve? It's a connecting role, and it starts in measure 9, and it ends in measure 25. And he uses a lot of sequential material. You'll remember hearing that sequence of material, and it's constructed using, first of all, the whole piece is constructed with the first measures being exposition 1 through 8 in G major. There's a modulatory sequence that's the transition from 9 to 25. And then in measure 26, we have new material. That's how this works. So what are the structural phenomena being used? Sequences and an arpeggiated bass. That arpeggiated bass, you'll remember, gives us this sound. It's sometimes called the Alberti bass. And he has exactly that happening in the bass clef. And that continues throughout that whole transition. So that's one of the identifying structural phenomena that one could talk about. And what's the modulation? From 1 to 5, from the key of G to the key of D. So that gives us a great example of how a transition works. It could be many forms. The transition could be 8 bars long. It could be a whole long section. So you get to decide by using your ear and by looking at the structural phenomena where the transition begins, where it ends, and what its purpose is. Next would be the developmental function. The developmental function is defined this way. So rhetorically, in other words, with respect to speech or writing, this function is analogous to how a thesis is developed in writing or in speeches. So after you hear the initial opening sentence, then you hear an amplification of the ideas. You hear a discussion about the pros and cons of those ideas, and you hear a presentation of evidence in support of the initial statement. Well, that's what a development does. In music, it's the presentation of that, maybe parts of that original expository material, or the whole thing itself. It's in variation. And it's in a variation of the initial structural phenomena, maybe the rhythm, the range, the timbre. It might be just parts of the motivic or melodic ideas in the exposition. And so you can use the structural units, the motives, the phrases, the periods, and change them. If you see a dramatic change, but it sounds like the material came from the exposition, you're looking at a development. It's often unstable to the original key or tonal centers. So frequently it modulates to other keys or has long moments of tonicization of chords. The important thing is other than the tonic. So that's what development really does. Let's listen to Beethoven and watch what he does. Now the development begins here in measure 17, goes through 28. Listen how he uses fragments of the first four notes. And I'm kind of answering these questions before we get into it. The tonal centers you're going to hear are C minor, B flat minor, A flat major, and then a half cadence in C minor. And then we ask ourselves, what are the structural phenomena being used? He uses sequences, descending repeated contour bass line. What I mean by that is the bass line keeps going down in the same contour. He repeats that over and over again. And then where is the transitional material back to a variation of the original motive, and that's in measure 28. So listen to how he develops something. Cadence. And cadence is on 5, by the way. Now, and then back to the original material. So what's so fascinating about that is you can really hear how he just flips everything over. In fact, he uses the descending bass line instead of he just uses it for 2 bars or in an upper register. So he changes the registers. He flips them over. There are all sorts of ways you can describe the development of the material. So that's how that works. And Beethoven is a master of writing developmental material, and it's one of the hallmarks of his music. Finally, we have the terminal function. And the terminal function is what brings the sections and the whole work to a close. Sometimes they may be developmental and fragmentary, often uses tonal activity that reestablishes the original key. So let's say we've developed a big long section and we've gone way away from the tonic, but you see it all of a sudden start to return back to original material and the original tonic, set up usually with 1-5, 1-5, 1-5 to really reestablish the pillars of tonality for the home key. And then, like I said, they may be partly developmental in character, and that makes it still interesting. But the terminal function leads up to an ending. Sometimes it has wonderful sequences, but usually you're going to hear a reiteration of the tonic and the dominant in some form. Or the 3 main pillars, so if I was in C, maybe F. For a while, that would be the 4 chord, set up to the 5-7 chord, and then finally home to 1. This would be true in minor as well. That could be the 4 chord in minor, to the 2 chord in minor, to the 5-7, and then back. So it's very typical. It sounds like it's going home. So once again, let's listen to Beethoven, and you can hear how toward measures 25 to 34, 1 and 5 are repeated over and over. And he uses an Alberti bass, Alberti meaning that arpeggiated bass in the left hand. And then there's wave-shaped contours to the main melody. He keeps that alive. There's a lot of motivic repetition and continuous cadences. You're going to hear a lot of cadences. And then why is the consistent 1-5, 1-5, 1-5 harmonic motion so important to make a terminal function? It's to reestablish emphatically the home key using the main pillars of tonality. So listen to what Beethoven did. Another digression. There's transitional. Very much transitional. Exposition again. Almost an exact repeat at the beginning. That digression is repeated. Now, this is the classical model that Beethoven was imitating for his students. Opening. So this is another exposition, a repeat of the exposition. Now listen how he ends all this. Five one. With emphatically arpeggiating the one chord at the end. So in this particular little example, we see a lot of everything that we've talked about. But the important thing is measures 25 through 34 in that they have a terminal function and it gets us home. So your assignment is going to be to analyze the battle song from the album For the Young by Robert Schumann, Opus 68, number 31. It's on Canvas. You can download that. Follow the instructions on Canvas. If you have any questions, email me. This is due in the beginning of the next period. And here's what the piece looks like when you see it. I won't play it for you now. I'll let you use that time to really start work on this assignment. But the battle song, you're going to notice all of the elements that we've talked about, all four of these functions. So you're to bracket those areas where the function takes place, then have a one-page summary. So you'll go expository function, tell me measures, and a few instances of the structural phenomena that make that happen. Then you go to the developmental section and or transition sections, depending which comes first. And then finally the terminative section, the function. So you'll bracket all of those, you'll label those on the battle song itself. So you need to print it off when you do this. And then what I would do is also, there's a handout that absolutely mirrors every example in this PowerPoint. Go through each one of those examples that we previously discussed. You can listen to them again on the PowerPoint and mark those. For practice, mark each one of those of all of the things that I talked about, the answers to all those questions. So when you're talking about, for instance, I'll give you the example of this particular function. We're looking at the developmental function defined. Ask yourself these questions. Where does it begin? So you could write that down. Give me an answer. It can be as simple as just a couple of measures. How does Schumann use fragmentation, if indeed he uses that? What are the tonal centers used? What are the structural phenomena? And where does this transition end and where does it go? So it's that kind of thing that you're going to be doing. I would also like in this lecture to give credit to the main source for this lecture. It's a textbook that I've used for years. It's a practical approach to the study of form and music by Peter Spencer and Peter Temko. It is magnificent. I highly would recommend getting this if you're going on to study form and analysis in college or independently. Now, this is one of the most fantastic books that I know of, and it's very contemporary. One of the older ones was Green, which is still a very good book, but this gives you all these practical approaches to be able to analyze any piece of music and figure out its form using the structures inherent within that piece. Well, please do the assignment, and thank you.